The deputy kept his hand on the wagon rail and would not look at the children. The horse harness ticked in the wind, frozen leather contracting in the cold, and smoke from the cabin chimney flattened sideways across the roof. A wool blanket covered the wagon bed. One black boot was visible beneath the edge, stiff, pointing at the sky. The woman stood in the doorway with a 6-year-old pressed against her hip, and the boy, 12, stood apart, already carrying himself like someone who understood what a covered wagon meant. The deputy removed his hat. He still could not find the words. The woman found them first. "How far from the door?" The distance was 30 feet. Kitchen door to woodshed latch, 30 feet across bare ground that Tolef Breka had packed flat with his own boots over 2 summers of hauling split cottonwood. In clear weather, a child could walk it without thinking. In the squall that took Tolef, those 30 feet had swallowed him whole. Marit Breka stood in the threshold of a cabin measuring 12 by 16 feet and looked at the place where they had found her husband's body. Not far, not even out of sight of the door on a calm day. He had gone out after a missing cow rope, and the wind had come down like a hand pressing a candle flat, and somewhere between the 6th step and the 10th, he had turned wrong. The deputy said he was 14 feet from the woodshed wall when they found him. 14 feet, close enough to hit with a thrown stone, and he had frozen there on his knees with his hands still reaching forward. She had 2 children. Niels was 12 and already carried wood without being asked. Eli was 6 and slept with her fist curled around a willow basket that Marit had brought from Telemark because it was the one thing light enough to fit inside a trunk that already held everything else they owned. She had a cow that gave thin milk. She had a stove with a cracked firebox plate that leaked smoke when the wind pressed from the northwest. She had $5.70 in coin kept inside a jar behind the flour bin. She had 1 3/4 cords of split cottonwood in the shed, and Amos Hask told her she needed 6. Amos came on the 3rd day after the burial. He was 64, a former freighter who had hauled goods across the territory before the railroad killed the wagon trade. He had buried 2 partners, 1 wife, and more livestock than he cared to count. He did not come to offer sympathy. He came to tell Marit what she already knew in her body but had not yet heard spoken aloud. He walked the property the way a man inspects a horse he expects to die. He stood at the kitchen door and looked at the woodshed. He opened the stove and ran his thumb along the crack in the firebox plate. He counted the split wood and shook his head before he finished counting. "Your door opens outward," Amos said. "First real drift, you will not move it. You will burn what is inside the cabin, and when that runs out, you will burn the table. And when the table is gone, you will break the chair legs, and by then the stove crack will have widened enough that the smoke drives you and the children into a corner, and that is where they will find you." Marit said nothing. She had learned in the weeks since Tolef's death that men spoke more honestly when they believed no one was listening. Amos walked to the woodshed. He opened the door, looked at the stacked cottonwood, and kicked the bottom of the pile. A log rolled free and split along a dry rot line. 1½ usable cords, he said. Maybe 1 3/4 if you burn the punky ones fast and hot. Your stove eats an armload every 3 hours in hard cold. That gives you what? 3 weeks if you are careful. Winter here lasts 5 months. He came back to the kitchen door and stood where Tolef had stood the night he walked out and did not come back. He pulled the door open and closed it twice, feeling the swing. The hinges were sound, but the frame had swelled from summer rain and the door stuck at the top corner. In a drift, that stick would become a seal. "What about a rope line?" Marit said. "Tolef strung one the first winter." A rope line. Amos said it the way a man says a word he has heard too many times, at too many funerals. "I have pulled 3 dead men off rope lines on this prairie. The rope does not freeze. The hands freeze. The rope does not lose direction. The mind loses direction. A man follows a rope for 30 feet in a whiteout, and somewhere around foot 20, his fingers stop feeling the fiber, and he lets go to warm them inside his coat for just a moment, and the wind moves him 4 feet sideways in that moment, and he reaches out and the rope is gone. Then what? You need lumber, Amos said. A proper plank passage from this door to that shed, roofed, walled, nailed tight, $24 minimum before hardware. You do not have $24. You do not have 12. You need men to build it, and you do not have men. You need time, and the ground is already freezing. He looked at the sod lean-to Tolliff had built for a summer kitchen. The north wall was already slumping where rain had softened the blocks. You could move wood inside the cabin, stack it against the east wall. With the children sleeping 3 feet from a stove that sparks through a cracked plate. Amos nodded. He had known the answer before he said it. He was listing options the way a doctor lists treatments for a disease he knows is terminal, not because they might work, but because silence felt worse than useless speech. Marit asked the question that had lived in her throat since the deputy brought Tolliff home. How far from the door? Amos looked at her. When they found him, she said. How far? 14 feet from the shed wall, 16 from the door. He was in the middle, exact middle. 30 feet. A distance she could cross in 12 steps on a July afternoon. A distance that became infinite when wind drove snow so hard that a woman could not see her own hand. And every time the stove needed wood, every 3 hours through a Dakota night when the temperature dropped past 30 below, that distance would be waiting. She could not leave. The claim was not proved. The mortgage note on the stove sat in Reuben Pike's ledger at the general store in town, 7 miles by Wagon Road, and if she abandoned the claim before proving it, Pike could buy the improvements for the cost of the unpaid note. Everything Tolliff had built, the cabin, the shed, the sod lean-to he used as a summer kitchen, would belong to a man who had never lifted a single log. The railroad fare east cost more than she possessed. She had no relatives within 100 miles. The nearest reliable neighbor, Lena Voss, lived 3/4 of a mile away and had 4 children of her own and a husband who counted every mouthful. Amos stood in the door and let cold air pour past him into the kitchen where Eli sat on the floor holding the willow basket. You do not need cleverness, Marit. You need lumber, men, and money. You have none of the 3. He put his hat on and walked to his horse. He did not offer to help. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had seen enough winters to know that kindness without resources was just a slower way to watch someone die. That night, Merritt sat at the table after the children slept and wrote numbers on the back of a feed bill. 6 cords of wood, $5.70, $24 for lumber, 30 feet of open ground, 1 stove that cracked, 1 woman, 2 children. She wrote the numbers and looked at them and felt the cabin walls press inward. Outside, the wind had not even started yet. This was autumn. Autumn was the easy part. She blew out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to Eli breathe. The willow basket sat on the floor beside the child's cot. One side crushed from the journey, the ribs bent but not broken. Marit reached down and pressed her thumb against one of the curved rods. It gave under her hand and then pushed back. She held it for a long time before she slept. The rope was Tolliff's. He had strung it between the kitchen door and the woodshed the first winter, back when he was alive, and thought that a line to follow was the same as a path to survive. Marit found it coiled on a nail inside the shed, stiff with ice from a rain that had frozen before Christmas last year. She carried it to the kitchen door and tied one end to the hinge pin. Niels watched her from the step. "Pa's rope," he said. "I know whose rope it is." She strung it taut across the 30 feet and tied the far end to the shed latch. Then she went inside, tied a flour sack over her eyes, and told Niels to shake a blanket near her face while she walked. She found the rope. She followed it hand over hand. She reached the shed. Her fingers were numb by the time she touched the latch, and she had been outside for less than a minute. She turned to walk back. The wind, real wind now, not a blanket, caught her skirt and pulled her sideways. The rope burned across her palm. From inside the cabin, Eli cried out, and Marit could not tell if the child was hurt or only lonely, and the sound came from the wrong direction because the wind bent it, and for 3 seconds she did not know which way to step. She pulled the flour sack off and stood in the thin October sunlight and looked at the rope and understood what Amos had not said. A rope did not stop cold. A rope did not stop wind. A rope did not stop the moment when a person's fingers let go because the skin could no longer feel the fiber. A rope only told a person where to be when they fell. She needed something a body could move through, not a line, a passage, a hollow. That night she sat by the stove and watched Eli sleep. The child's hand was wrapped around the willow basket, the same basket Marit's grandmother had made in Telemark, from green withies cut along the river and bent over a form while steam softened the grain. One side was crushed from the journey in the trunk, but the ribs had not snapped. They had bent, and then held their curve, and the basket was still a basket. Marit picked it up. She pressed the crushed side and felt the ribs give and return. She turned the basket in the lamplight and studied the weave, rods crossing at angles, each one locked against the next, pressure traveling sideways through the lattice so that no single rod bore the full weight. She remembered her grandmother bending a willow rod across her knee beside a peat fire, warming it with steam from a kettle, showing Marit how a curve survives wind better than a flat board. The old woman had pressed Marit's hand against a woven eel trap and said something Marit had not thought about in years. The wind passes over what it cannot catch. Flat boards catch wind. Curves shed it. Flat walls take snow head on. Curves let it slide and pack. Before dawn, Marit walked to the slough where willow grew in low thickets along the creek bottom. The cattle had browsed the young shoots short, but further in, where the ground stayed wet, green rods grew as thick as her thumb and taller than Neil's. She cut one with Tollef's hatchet, carried it back to the cabin, and drove both ends into the ground 3 feet apart. The arch held. She bent another rod across it, perpendicular, and lashed the crossing point with a scrap of raw hide. The shape looked like half a barrel hoop buried in the earth. She pushed against the crown. The willow flexed and came back. She pushed harder. The ribs spread the pressure between them. She stood and looked at the arch, and then looked at the 30 feet between her kitchen door and the woodshed. 30 feet. 160 arches at 18 inches apart. 400 rods for ribs and weavers, plus replacements for the ones that would crack. Mud and straw for daub. Rawhide and bark for lashing. A tunnel 5 feet high at the crown, 3.5 feet wide at the base, ribbed and woven and smeared with clay. A passage built like a basket, connecting the living to the fuel. The design made sense in her hands. She could feel the logic of it the way her grandmother had felt the logic of an eel trap. Rounded shapes do not catch wind. Woven structures flex instead of splitting. Drifting snowpacks against a curve and becomes insulation instead of destruction. The tunnel did not need to carry a roof load like a room. It needed to block wind and hold a hollow. The willow would do the blocking, the snow would do the rest. But the design also made no sense to anyone who looked at it from outside. It was basket work. It was a woman weaving sticks in the dirt because she could not afford boards. It was, as the men would say, not serious. Lena Voss came the next afternoon. She was 38, sharp-jawed, with hands roughened from lye soap, and 4 children who ate more than her husband liked to calculate. She stood at the edge of the first test arch and looked at it with her head tilted. "How does mud hold in freeze-thaw?" Lena said. Not a question. An inventory of failure. "It does not need to hold like a wall," Marit said. "It needs to stop wind. The mud fills the gaps between rods. When it cracks, the rods still stand. And when the rods dry out and go brittle. Green willow takes a full season to dry. By then the snow has packed around it. And the entrances. Snow will bury the openings before it buries the middle." This one Marit did not have an answer for. Not yet. She said so, and Lena's eyebrows rose because honesty from a woman building something impossible was not what she expected. "I am not laughing," Lena said. "I am asking how you will eat while your hands are in creek mud." Marit set a small woven panel she had made that morning against the cabin's west wall. She dusted it with ash from the stove. Then she set a flat board from a broken crate beside it. They waited. The wind came steady from the northwest, the way it always did in autumn. After 10 minutes, the ash on the curved panel had barely moved. The ash on the flatboard was gone, scattered across the frozen dirt. Snow, when it came, would behave the same way. The curve would shed, the flat surface would catch. Lena looked at the panel and then at Marit, and then at the panel again. She did not say the word clever. She said, "You will need help cutting rods." She did not come back to help. Not yet, but she did not laugh, and on the prairie in October of 1887, that was worth more than charity. The gossip reached Pike's store before the first rib was planted. Reuben Pike was 46 years old, thick through the shoulders, and possessed of the kind of patience that made him dangerous. He owned the general store, held notes on 6 families' stoves and plows, and understood that a widow who failed was a claim he could buy cheap in spring. He did not need Marit to die. He needed her to quit. She came to the store on a Tuesday for a pound of nails and 3 yards of sacking. She needed the nails for the entrance frames and the sacking to reinforce the mud daub at stress points. She had the money. She set the coins on the counter and waited. Pike looked at the coins and then at her. "A woman alone ought to sell before winter teaches her arithmetic," he said. Marit did not answer. She waited for the nails. Pike leaned on the counter. 2 men sat by the stove behind her. She could feel them listening. "I hear you are building something between the house and the shed," Pike said. His voice carried. He meant it to. "Weaving it, they tell me, like a basket." One of the men by the stove made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You intend to heat a house," Pike said, "or weave one." Marit held out her hand for the nails. Pike set them on the counter slowly. He was not done. "I will buy the cow," he said. "Half value, and I will forgive 1 month on the stove note. That gives you cash and time. You can use the money for a real passage, or you can use it for railroad fare." The trap was built with a storekeeper's precision. Without the cow, the children lost milk through winter. Without the debt relief, Pike kept the note as leverage. If she took his offer, she was weaker. If she refused, she had made a public enemy. "The cow is not for sale," Marit said. "Marit." Pike leaned closer. The 2 men by the stove had stopped pretending not to listen. "When that worm collapses, do not come to my counter asking for charity." She took the nails and the sacking and left. Outside, a boy sitting on the loading dock called after her. "Brecca's building a basket for herself to live in." He had heard it from somewhere, already shaped into a joke. The name stuck, the woven worm. Boys followed her wagon on the road to see the unfinished ribs standing in the ground like the skeleton of something dead. Men at the blacksmith shop said it would catch snow like a fish net. One said the first gale would roll it clear to Minnesota. Another said a proper man would move the shed, not braid weeds between doors. The preacher's wife told Lena that Marit's grief had turned her mind. The freighter who delivered salt to Pike's store slowed his team to stare and then flicked the reins without saying a word, which was worse than laughter because it meant the thing was not even worth mocking. The cost was not only public. Lena stopped visiting for 4 days because her husband, Carl, told her that people were laughing at anyone seen helping the widow with her basket. Carl was not unkind. He was a man with 4 mouths to feed who understood that reputation was currency on the prairie, and he could not afford to spend it on a woman building something no one had ever seen work. Niels came home from the schoolhouse with a split lip and would not say who hit him. He sat on the floor near the stove and sharpened Tollef's hatchet with a file, and the sound of metal on metal filled the cabin for an hour. Eli asked very quietly at supper whether their house was shameful. The word cut deeper than anything Pike had said because Eli had heard it somewhere and brought it home the way a child brings home a burr in her stocking, not knowing it would draw blood. Marit nearly quit that night, not because the men were right, because the children were paying for a thing she had not yet proven. She sat at the table after they slept and looked at the numbers on the feed bill and thought about Pike's offer and knew that taking it was the beginning of the end, that a woman who sold her cow and accepted debt relief from the man who wanted her claim was a woman who had already lost. She did not sleep. She went outside before dawn and drove 2 more willow butts into the frozen ground and bent them into arches and tied them with rawhide while her breath made clouds in the dark. Pike had moved from mockery to pressure. That meant he believed failure was not certain. A man who was sure of the outcome would simply wait. Construction started the last week of September, and the ground was already beginning to resist. Marit and Niels left the cabin before sunrise and walked to the slough where the willow grew. The creek bottom was soft from overnight frost that melted in the first hour of sun, and their boots sank past the ankles. Marit cut rods with Tollef's hatchet, selecting green ones as thick as her thumb, rejecting anything that showed bark cracking or pith darkening at the cut. Niels carried bundles of 20 to the wagon. Eli stayed in the cabin and kept the stove fed, a job she performed with the grave attention of a child who understood more than she could say. The first harvest yielded 90 usable rods. Marit needed 400 for the ribs, diagonal weavers, and replacements. At 90 rods a day, the cutting alone would take more than 4 days. 4 days in which she was not building, not mending, not hauling water, not feeding children, not splitting the wood she already had into stove-length pieces. Her hands blistered between thumb and forefinger by the second morning. The hatchet handle was wrapped in leather that had dried and cracked, and each stroke drove the edge of the wrap into the soft web of skin. She wrapped her hands in strips torn from a flour sack and kept cutting. By midday, her arms trembled when she lifted the hatchet above her shoulder. Niels took over cutting while she sorted rods into 3 piles, thick, medium, thin, using the only grading system she knew, which was how the rod felt when she bent it. The thick ones resisted and then gave smoothly. The medium ones curved with a creak. The thin ones bent like green thread. She did not yet know which pile belonged where. She only knew they were different. The first 10 feet of tunnel went crooked. She had set the ribs too far apart, almost 2 feet instead of 18 inches, and the arch sagged at the crown where the paired rods did not overlap enough. Wind whistled through the gaps between weavers. She stood inside the half-finished section and felt the air move past her face, and knew that in a blizzard, this would be no better than standing outside with a blanket over her head. She pulled the first ribs out and started again, tighter this time, 18 inches between each pair, the butts driven deeper. The ground fought her. Each hole had to be punched with a sharpened stick and then widened with the hatchet handle before the willow butt would seat. Her shoulders ached from the overhead work of bending rods into the crown. 2 rods cracked during bending because the sun had dried them past the point of flex. She lost an afternoon to a rain that turned the worksite to mud and loosened the butt ends she had already planted. She reseated them the next morning with her knees in cold water, packing clay around the base of each rod with her bare hands, because gloves were too clumsy for the work. Eli carried twine pieces in her apron pocket and handed them to Marit when a lashing was needed, walking carefully along the unfinished ribs with the concentration of a child who has decided she is part of something. The twine was scrap, short ends salvaged from feed bags and flour sacking, and each piece was barely long enough to tie a single crossing. Marit needed hundreds of these ties. She needed rawhide, bark strips, salvaged wire. She needed everything and had almost nothing. By the end of the first week, she had 10 feet of tunnel that looked like a rib cage half buried in the earth, and 20 feet of open ground still between her and the woodshed. The sky in the north had a flat gray weight that pressed closer each morning. The first hard frost came on the last day of September. Marit woke to ice on the inside of the window glass and knew that every warm day left was a day she could work with bare hands, and the warm days were leaving. That was when Sjur Asen arrived. He came from the west on a mule cart loaded with hides, a man of 59 whose face had been shaped by wind the way water shapes river rock, everything worn to the essential. He was Métis Norwegian, born on the Red River, trained as a trapper and jack of all trades, carrying in his hands the knowledge of 3 cultures' worth of building, mending, and making do. He had come through the settlement to trade hides for flour and salt, and was leaving when he saw Marit reject a willow rod. She had bent it near the butt, the way she tested every rod before cutting. The rod cracked instead of curving. She threw it aside and reached for the next. The movement was quick, confident, and informed. She knew what she was looking for. She was not guessing. Sjur stopped the mule. He watched her cut and test 3 more rods. 2 she kept. One she rejected. The rejection was correct. The rod had a hidden split that would have failed under snow load. She could not have seen it. She had felt it through the bend. "You are cutting too late in the day," Shure said from the cart. Marit looked up. She had not heard him approach, which meant her focus had narrowed to the work, and the world outside it had gone silent. That was dangerous on the prairie. She made a note of it. "The sun stiffens the rods after mid-morning," Shure said. "Cut before the dew burns off. The fiber is softer. You get a cleaner bend and fewer cracks." He climbed down from the cart. He did not ask what she was building. He walked to the standing ribs and looked at them from the side, then ducked and looked from inside, then pressed one rib at the crown and felt how the adjacent ribs took the pressure. "Sort them by sound," he said. He picked up a rejected rod and bent it sharply. It snapped with a dry crack like a bone breaking. Then he picked up a good rod and bent it to the same degree. It groaned, a slow, fibrous complaint that rose in pitch before it would have broken. He stopped before it did. A good green rod complains before it breaks. A dead one snaps like bone. Listen to them. He was not offering charity. He had seen competence and responded to it. Marit recognized the difference because her grandmother had taught the same way, not out of pity, but out of respect for someone who was already working correctly and could be shown how to work better. Over the next 2 days, Shure taught through demonstration. He did not take over. He showed, and then he watched Marit do it, and when she did it wrong, he said so without softening. He taught her rod grading first. Thick rods for ribs, the structural arches that held the shape. Thumb-thick rods for diagonals, the cross members that turned a row of arches into a woven surface. Finger-thick whips for tight weaving in the gaps. He rejected rods that looked perfect but had invisible cracks, running his thumbnail along the bark to find the flaw. He taught her steam softening using the wash boiler. Marit heated water and draped wet burlap over stubborn rods, holding them above the steam until the fiber relaxed. The difference was immediate. A dry rod that fought the bend and threatened to crack became, after 3 minutes of steam, a rod that curved into the crown as if it wanted to be there. Shure showed her the angle, 45 degrees from the butt, bending toward the natural curve of the growth, and the speed. Too fast and the fibers sheared. Too slow and the rod cooled before it set. He taught her the locking weave. Not merely crossing rods over the ribs, but reversing direction every third rib so that pressure could not travel in a straight line. When Marit pushed on a section woven this way, the whole panel flexed as a unit. When she pushed on a section woven straight, the pressure concentrated at 2 points and the rods spread apart. "Pressure sideways," Shure said. "Never let it travel in one direction. The snow will push from above. The wind will push from the side. If the weave sends force both ways, no single rod takes the whole load." On the second afternoon, he made Marit build an entire span, rib to rib, 18 inches, while he sat on an upturned bucket and watched. She made one mistake. She tied a lashing where it would rub against the diagonal weaver during flex. He pointed at it. "That will saw through in 2 weeks. Move it to the crossing point where nothing slides." She moved it. He nodded. He did not praise. Praise was not what she needed. She needed to know when she was right and when she was wrong, and he told her both with equal weight. But he would not stay. He had hides to sell and a root to keep. On the morning of the 3rd day, he tied his cart and said he might come through again before the hard freeze. "The entrances are your weak point," he said before he left. "The tunnel middle will hold. The 2 ends where the doors are, where feet stamp and drift pushes hardest and ice forms on the threshold. Those will fail first. Frame them with something stiff, barrel staves if you can find them, willow hoops doubled and braced." He climbed onto the cart. The mule started forward. "Sure," Marit said. He waited. "Thank you." He looked at the tunnel ribs standing in the ground, the 15 feet already woven, the remaining distance stretching toward the shed. "Finish it," he said. "Then thank me." The mule pulled the cart west, and Marit stood with a rod in each hand and watched him go. and the open ground between the end of her tunnel and the woodshed door was still 15 feet of nothing, and the sky in the north had the flat gray weight of a season that would not wait for anyone to be ready. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been mocked for building something other people did not understand? She had 15 feet built and 15 feet remaining. She had blistered hands and aching shoulders, and a stove that cracked, and children who needed feeding, and wood that needed splitting, and a cow that needed milking, and water that needed hauling, and a mortgage that needed paying, and a town that called her work a worm. She had a mentor who might come back and might not. She had a design that worked on a small panel and had not been tested at full scale. She had every reason to stop and no reason that the world would recognize to continue. But she had heard the willow rod complain before it broke, and she knew the difference between a thing that snapped and a thing that bent, and the tunnel was still bending. The next morning, she was in the slough before dawn, cutting rods in the dark by feel, listening for the sound that meant alive. October turned the prairie the color of rust and bone. Marit cut willow before dawn because Sjur had told her the rods were softer before the dew burned off, and she could feel the difference now. A rod cut at first light bent into the crown with a slow, fibrous groan. A rod cut at noon fought back and sometimes cracked at the apex, wasting the trip to the slough and the hour of hauling. She learned to listen to the sound of each rod the way Sjur had taught her, the living complaint of good wood, the dead snap of bad, and she rejected more than she kept, which meant she cut twice as many as she needed and carried half of them home. Niels worked beside her without being asked and without complaining, and both of those things frightened her because a 12-year-old boy who does not complain is a boy who has decided to be a man, and she was not ready for that. By the second week of October, she had 240 usable rods sorted into Sjur's 3 grades: thick ribs, thumb-thick diagonals, and finger-thin whips for gap weaving. She stacked them in bundles of 20 along the south side of the cabin, where rain could not reach them and sun could not dry them too fast. The pile looked substantial until she counted what remained to build. 15 feet of tunnel still needed roughly 160 rods for ribs and weavers, plus 50 replacements for breakage. She was short. She had been short since the beginning, and the distance between what she had and what she needed was the distance that lived inside every calculation she made. Always a gap, always a deficit, always the math saying she could not do the thing she was doing. The tunnel grew in increments that could be measured against the body. 15 feet to 18 feet in 3 days of weaving. At 18 feet, she applied the first coat of mud daub, creek clay mixed with chopped straw and water, spread thin over the woven exterior with her bare hands because a trowel was too rigid for the curved surface. The mud filled the gaps between rods and turned the open lattice into something that resembled a wall, though a wall so thin a person could push a finger through it in places. That was the point. The mud was not structure. It was windbreak. The rods were structure. The first frost cracked the daub overnight. Marit came out at dawn and found a web of fracture lines running through the dried clay, like veins on the back of a hand. Chunks had fallen away, exposing the weave beneath. She stood looking at the damage and felt the kind of cold that does not come from weather. If the mud could not survive one frost, the tunnel would be bare lattice by November, and bare lattice was not shelter. She mixed the next batch differently. More straw, less water, and she added ashes from the stove, pressing the mixture into the cracks with her thumb. The ash clay held better. Not perfectly. Small fractures still appeared by morning, but the chunks stayed attached to the rods, and the weave beneath remained covered. She would patch all winter. She understood that now. The tunnel was not a finished thing. It was a living repair, like the stove, like the cabin, like everything on the prairie that survived only because someone kept fixing it. At 22 feet, she ran out of rawhide for lashings. She had used every scrap from the deer hide Tolif had tanned the previous spring, every strip she could cut from worn-out boot leather, every length of salvaged harness strap. The remaining lashings would need to be bark, twisted straw rope, or wire, and she had almost no wire. Amos came again. He stood at the entrance to the tunnel, the kitchen side opening still unframed, raw willow ends poking from the ground, and looked down the length of it, He had to stoop to see inside. The interior was dim, smelling of damp clay and green wood, the light from the far end a gray circle the size of a dinner plate. "It stands," Amos said. "It stands." "Standing is not the same as holding." "I know." He pushed a rib at the midpoint with the heel of his hand. The whole section flexed, a visible movement, the crown dipping an inch and then returning. Amos stepped back. "Willow is for baskets, Marit. Winter does not live in baskets." "Winter has not tried this basket." Amos looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted, not quite respect, but the beginning of the road toward it. He left without offering help, but he also left without repeating that she should sell. Then Pike escalated. On a Wednesday morning, Marit found her stored willow scattered across the ground near the cabin. 20 rods, orkat, a full day's harvest, had been chewed, bent, and trampled. Pig tracks scored the mud around the pile. Pike kept hogs in a pen behind the store, and the pen had a gate that required a hand to open it. 2 boys had been seen near her property the previous evening. Amos caught them on the road the next day and drove them back toward town with language that made his horse's ears flatten. But the damage was done. 20 rods ruined, a day lost, and the message delivered. Pike would not merely wait for her to fail. He would help it along. Marit did not go to the store to confront him. She went to the slough and cut 30 rods to replace the 20 she had lost, plus 10 extra because she could no longer trust that her stores would remain safe overnight. She stacked the new rods inside the half-built tunnel where the pigs could not reach them, and she kept the hatchet by the door. Niels asked her what she would do if the boys came back. She said, "I will do what I am doing now. And if Pike comes himself." He will not come himself. Men like Pike send boys and hogs. Unexpected help arrived after dark on a Thursday. Lena Voss came with rye bread wrapped in cloth, a crock of lard, and 2 daughters, Hilda, 14, and Annika, 11, who knew how to twist straw rope because their mother had taught them the same way Marit's grandmother had taught her, which was by putting the materials in their hands and telling them to make something useful. Lena said nothing sentimental. She looked at the tunnel entrance, looked at the stored rods, looked at Marit's hands wrapped in flour sack strips, and asked where to sit. The girls sat on the cabin floor and twisted straw rope by lamplight while Lena and Marit ate bread and lard in silence. And the silence was more than Marit could have said in an hour of conversation. It meant, "I see what you are doing. I cannot say it is right. I am here anyway." The straw rope was rough and stiff compared to rawhide, but it held a knot, and each length was long enough to lash 3 crossing points. The girls produced 40 lengths before they tired. Lena took them home in the dark, walking the 3/4 of a mile by lantern, and Marit watched the light shrink across the prairie until it disappeared. Construction pushed past 22 feet, 25 feet. At 28 feet, the tunnel reached the point where the woodshed's shadow fell in the afternoon, and the ground was harder here because it dried faster in the sun. Marit broke 2 sharpened stakes trying to punch rib holes into soil that had already begun to freeze solid. She poured kettle water into the holes to soften them, but the water froze before she could seat the willow butts. She switched to the hatchet, chopping small divots into the earth and jamming the rod end sideways into the loosened soil. The last 2 feet were the hardest, not because of the ground, but because of the entrance throat. Schur had warned her. The most dangerous point was not the tunnel middle, but the 2 doors, where drift pressure and foot traffic would break the edges. The woodshed collar needed to be stiff enough to hold its shape against snowpacking from above and boots kicking from below, while the tunnel body behind it needed to flex. Stiff meeting flex was a joint that wanted to tear. She framed the woodshed collar from 3 barrel staves she had found behind Pike's store on a day when Pike was not watching. She soaked them in the creek until they bent, lashed them to doubled willow hoops, and wedged the whole assembly against the shed door frame. The kitchen side collar she built from the thickest willow rods she had, bent into hoops and braced with cross pieces salvaged from a broken crate. Neither collar was elegant. Both were ugly and overbuilt and wrapped in so much rawhide and straw rope that they looked like bandaged wounds. On the 23rd of October, Marit drove the last rib into the ground, bent it into the crown, and lashed it to the diagonal weaver on each side. The tunnel was 30 feet long, 5 feet high at the crown, 3.5 feet wide at the base, ribbed every 18 inches with paired willow saplings, woven between ribs with diagonal rods locked in Schur's reversing pattern, daubed with ash clay and straw on the outside, open on the inside, where a person could walk, stooped, or a child could walk nearly upright. It connected the kitchen door to the woodshed door. It was finished, and it had not faced a single storm. By early December, the prairie had tested the tunnel in small ways, and the tunnel had answered imperfectly. In a 20-mile wind, smoke from the kitchen chimney bent flat against the roof, but inside the tunnel, the air moved slowly enough that Eli could carry a lit candle halfway to the shed without the flame dying. Marit watched the candle from the kitchen entrance and counted the seconds. The flame bent but held. That meant the interior wind speed was low enough to walk through without the kind of gusting that steals heat from a body. In a 3-inch snowfall, powder sifted through some upper gaps where the daub had cracked or fallen away. The lower sides, where snow touched the ground, packed tight against the woven surface and sealed the lattice from outside. The snow became the wall the mud had tried to be. Marit noted where the sifting was worst. 3 places near the crown, on the northwest side, where the prevailing wind pushed finest snow through the weave, and she patched from outside, pressing fresh mud into the cracks while standing on a bucket in the cold. She chalked marks on the inside every 5 feet, so the children could count their progress in darkness. 5 feet from the kitchen door, 10 feet, 15, 20, 25, 30 feet to the shed, 6 marks. Each one a handhold in the mind, a way to know where you were when sight failed. The skeptics were not finished. Amos came and walked through the tunnel and came out the other end and said it had held weather, but weather was not winter. A 20-mile wind was a conversation. A blizzard was a war. Lena admitted the tunnel helped in a small blow, but feared that a heavy drift would crush it, that the weight of compacted snow on a curved surface would push the ribs inward until the crown collapsed and the passage filled. Pike said a child could kick through it, which was not true, but sounded true because the daub was thin and the woven surface looked fragile from outside. Schur returned in the last week before Christmas, coughing worse than when he had left. The cough came from deep in his chest and bent him forward at the waist when it seized him. He did not explain, and Marit did not ask. He walked the tunnel slowly, touching ribs with his fingertips, testing lashings by feel in the dim interior. At 2 places near the kitchen collar, the lashings had loosened from freeze-thaw cycling. He tightened them with a twist of wire he carried in his coat pocket. At the woodshed end, he pressed the crown and watched the flex. The section moved and returned. He pressed harder. The adjacent ribs took the pressure and spread it sideways, just as the locking weave was designed to do. "Do not overdaub the outside," Schur said. "I can see where you have patched. The instinct is to make it thick, to fill every crack. Do not. Too stiff, and it breaks. Let it breathe enough to move." "The snow comes through the cracks," Marit said. "Some snow coming through is better than the whole thing snapping because it could not flex." He coughed, and the sound echoed inside the tunnel like something trapped. "The ribs must answer each other. If one pushes in, the neighbors must take the load. They can only do that if the daub does not lock them rigid." He stayed one night. He slept on the floor near the stove and coughed through the dark hours, and in the morning he checked the tunnel once more and left without eating breakfast. Marit gave him a sack of flour and 2 pounds of salt, which was more than she could spare, and he took it because refusing would have insulted the terms of their exchange. The days turned mild in early January. Strangely mild. Drips fell from the cabin eaves in mid-morning, and the mud around the tunnel base softened to the point where Marit could push a stick into the ground without effort. The mildness felt wrong. The air had a thickness to it, a weight that did not match the season. Newspapers in town mentioned sharp cold in Canada moving south, but the men at Pike's store said it was just a January thaw and winter would resume at its own pace. People grew careless. Children walked to school without heavy wraps. Men left tools outside. Livestock drank from thawed puddles. The world relaxed, and Merritt watched the relaxation with the tight stomach of a woman who had already buried one person killed by weather that arrived without warning. She stacked extra wood inside the shed, 3 armloads beyond what she normally kept outside, and cleared both tunnel throats of mud and debris. She filled the kitchen water bucket to the brim. She told Niels to keep his heavy coat near the door, even though the air was warm enough for shirt sleeves. "It does not feel like storm," Niels said. "Your father said that," Marit said. She did not need to finish the sentence. January 12th, 1888. The morning began warm enough that ice on the water bucket had not formed overnight. Eli complained that her wool stockings itched because the air was too close for wool. Niels asked to go check a snare line he had set along the creek. Marit refused. She could not explain why. The air tasted wrong, flat, metallic, the way it tasted before the squall that had taken Tolev, like the sky was holding something behind its teeth. By 10 in the morning, the western horizon disappeared. Not gradually, the way a cloud bank builds. All at once, as if a wall had been erected between earth and sky. The light changed. The shadows lost their edges. The wind, which had been calm, arrived as a sound before it arrived as a force. A low moan that rose in pitch until it became a scream, and then the snow came with it, horizontal, driving so hard that the barn vanished from the kitchen window between one breath and the next. Temperature dropped fast enough that the drips on the eaves froze into teeth of ice within minutes. The warmth of the morning became a memory so quickly that it felt like a lie the weather had told to catch people in the open, and it had caught them. Across the prairie, children were walking between schoolhouses and homes. Men were in fields, in barns, on roads without heavy clothing. The storm had waited for trust and then struck. Marit's first thought was the stove. The firebox held enough wood for 2 hours, maybe 3. The wood box beside the stove held 1 armload. After that, the kitchen would begin to cool, and in the kind of cold that was coming, the kind that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground, a cabin without fuel became a coffin within hours. Her second thought was the children. Niels was inside. Eli was inside. Both accounted for. She barred the kitchen door and stuffed rags along the bottom where wind drove snow through the gap. Then someone knocked. The sound was so faint she thought it was the wind rattling the hinge pin. Then it came again, lower, not a knock, but a palm pressed flat against the door and dragged downward. Marit pulled the bar and opened the door against the drift that had already begun to build on the step, and a boy fell forward into the kitchen. Peter Voss, Lena's youngest, 8 years old. He had been sent home from the schoolhouse when the teacher saw the sky change, and he had walked the first half-mile before the wind took his direction away. He had found Merritt's cabin because the tunnel was the only shape that did not disappear in the whiteout. The mounded snow on its surface rose above the flat, drifting like a spine, and he had followed it to the kitchen door. One mitten was gone. The hand beneath it was white at the fingertips. His lips were blue-gray, and he could not speak clearly. He shook so hard that his teeth sounded like a spoon rattling in a cup. Marit pulled him to the stove. She stripped the wet coat and wrapped him in a wool blanket and put his bare hand against her stomach under her shirt because body heat was faster than stove heat for fingers that had gone past numbness into damage. Niels fed the stove without being told. Eli stood in the corner and watched the boy's face and did not speak. 3 children now, 1 injured, and the wood box was half empty. Marit looked at the kitchen door. Windscreen past the gap at the threshold. Snow had already sealed the bottom of the door. She could see white packing tight against the lower planks. The drift would be knee-deep within the hour. By nightfall, it could bury the step entirely. The woodshed was 30 feet away. The stove ate an armload every 3 hours. She had enough inside for 2 hours. After that, the cabin would cool, and a cabin cooling with 3 children inside, one of them already showing frostbite, was a cabin counting down. She tied a rope around her waist. Not because she feared getting lost inside the tunnel, because fear was a physical thing that lived in her legs, and the rope was something her hands could hold when her legs wanted to stop. She opened the kitchen door. The drift had piled against the outer step but had not yet blocked the tunnel collar. The collar, ugly, overbuilt, wrapped in rawhide and straw rope, jutted from the cabin wall like a bandaged fist, and its curved top had shed the worst of the snow to either side. The entrance was clear, dark, but clear. She stepped inside. The sound changed instantly. Outside was a roar, wind and ice and the vibration of air moving fast enough to strip skin from a face. Inside the tunnel, the roar became a muffled drum. The ribs hummed around her. She could feel them vibrating under her hands as she touched the walls for balance, each rod trembling with the force of the wind pressing against the woven exterior. The floor was frozen earth, uneven, ridged where mud had hardened in boot prints from autumn. She moved carefully, one hand on the left wall, feeling the woven surface under her fingers. Rod, gap, the rhythm of the lattice marking her progress. Snow sifted through 3 places in the crown, the same places she had patched and repatched all autumn, and the fine powder dusted her shoulders and hair like flour from a shaken sack. The cold inside was sharper than the cabin, but nothing like the killing air outside. She could breathe without her throat closing. She could see, barely, because the darkness was not absolute. Gray light filtered through the weave in places where the daub had fallen, and the lantern she had hung at the woodshed end still glowed, a small orange circle at the far end of the passage, 30 feet away, steady and alive. She walked toward it. The tunnel smelled of damp clay and green wood and cold iron. Under her feet, the ground crunched, ice crystals forming on the surface where her breath had condensed and frozen. She counted the chalk marks as she passed them. 5 feet, 10 feet, 15. At the midpoint, she felt a rib bend inward under her left shoulder. Drift pressure. Snow was packing against the outside of the tunnel from the northwest, and the weight was pushing the crown down. The rib pressed against her coat. She could hear rawhide creaking, the lashing at the crossing point stretching under load. Shure's voice in her memory. Too stiff, and it breaks. Let it breathe enough to move. She pushed back, not hard, steady. She pressed her shoulder against the bent rib and felt it resist, then give, then transfer the pressure sideways into the adjacent ribs. The whole section flexed, a wave of movement that traveled 3 ribs in each direction, spreading the load. The crown lifted back to its original height. The creaking stopped. The tunnel was doing what Shure had designed it to do. It was bending without breaking. The snow was pushing, and the willow was answering, and the conversation between them was holding. She reached the woodshed. The door opened inward, into the tunnel collar, because Marit had rehung the hinges in October, knowing that an outward opening door would be sealed by drift. The shed was cold but dry. The wood was stacked and split. She loaded 4 logs onto the rope sled she had built from a plank and 2 runners, and she dragged it back through the tunnel to the kitchen door. The return trip was harder. The sled caught on uneven ground where the tunnel floor had not been leveled. She pulled it over frozen ridges of mud and packed earth, the rope cutting into her hands through the flour sack wraps. At the midpoint, she checked the bent rib again. It had settled back to its position. The drift outside was heavier now. She could hear the snow compacting against the woven surface with a sound like sand being poured into a sack. But the ribs held. She fed the stove. Peter had stopped shaking. His fingertips had gone from white to red, which meant the blood was returning, which meant the flesh might live. Eli had found a second blanket and laid it over the boy without being asked. Niels stood by the door. "How bad?" Niels said. "The tunnel holds. The crown is taking drift on the west side. 1 rib bent, and I pushed it back." "Will it last?" Marit did not lie to her son. "I do not know. I will go again in 2 hours. Stay with this story and subscribe if you are invested now, because the next walk through that tunnel decides whether a child lives." She went again at dusk. The drift had buried the sides of the tunnel completely. What had been a visible ribbed mound was now a smooth white ridge between cabin and shed, indistinguishable from the surrounding snow except for the 2 dark openings at each end. The collar mouths she had built too ugly and too strong and just strong enough. Inside, the tunnel had changed. The temperature had dropped. The air was colder than the cabin, but warmer than outside. Somewhere in between, a kind of cold that numbed the face but did not freeze it. The snow packed around the exterior had sealed the cracks. The sifting had stopped. The wind noise had dropped from a drum to a whisper. The tunnel had become what Sieur never said aloud but understood in his hands. The drift was not destroying it. The drift was completing it. Snow was the final layer of insulation, the wall the mud had tried to be and the wind had torn away. The willow was the skeleton, the weave was the skin, the snow was the coat. Marit walked in slippers on the second trip because boots were too clumsy on the uneven floor. She hauled 6 logs this time, the sled riding smoother over ground that had frozen solid. She brought the kettle back empty to fill with heated stones from the stove, smooth creek rocks she had collected in autumn and kept near the firebox. She wrapped 2 stones in cloth and placed them against Peter's feet. The boy flinched when the heat reached him, which was good. Flinching meant feeling. Feeling meant life. Outside, the settlement was dying. Amos Hask's front door was jammed by drift piled to the lintel. He chopped through the side window frame with a hand axe, cutting away the sash and frame to create a gap wide enough to climb through. He was 64 years old, and the cold hit him like a hand across the face. His woodpile was 12 feet from the window. He reached it on his knees, filled a sack, and crawled back. The trip took 8 minutes. His beard froze to his scarf. Pike's store back door sealed shut. Glaze ice from the morning thaw had bonded the frame to the door, and drift packed against it from outside locked it further. 2 customers and Pike were inside with a stove that held 4 hours of coal. The coal shed stood 15 yards behind the store. A hired boy, 17, attempted the distance. He made it to the coal shed. He filled a bucket. He turned back and lost the store in the white. He walked in a circle for 3 minutes before stumbling against the rear wall. When he reached the door, his cheeks were frostbitten gray-white, and his fingers could not grip the latch. Pike pulled him inside by the collar. 3/4 of a mile to the east, a bachelor named Orrin Bell heard livestock breaking a rail in his barn. He followed the fence line from his door. The fence ran 60 yards to the barn. At the 40-yard mark, a drift had buried the rail, and the fence disappeared beneath snow that was chest-deep and hard-packed. Orrin stepped off the line. He took 4 steps in what he thought was the direction of the barn. By the 5th step, the barn was gone, and the fence was gone, and the sky was gone. He was found alive the next morning behind a haystack 200 yards from his door, unconscious, his coat frozen stiff as board lumber. Inside Marit's cabin, the stove burned steady. Wood arrived through the tunnel every 2 hours. Peter's color improved. His fingers swelled red and painful, but the skin did not blacken. Marit made broth from dried beef and creek water and fed the boy with a spoon because his hands could not hold a cup. Eli held the cup steady. Niels kept the stove loaded, and the ash pan cleared. Near midnight, the wind peaked. The cabin walls groaned. Snow drove against the north side with a force that vibrated the floor planks. Marit went into the tunnel for the 4th time. The crown had sagged in 2 new places. Drift weight pressed the ribs inward, and the lashings at the crossing points stretched with a sound that made her stop breathing. She pressed upward with both hands, rib to rib, the way Sieur had showed her, pushing the load sideways instead of trying to hold it alone. The ribs answered. The weave spread the pressure. The crown lifted. She spoke aloud in the dark. Rib to rib, pressure sideways. Let it move. Niels was waiting at the kitchen collar. He had heard the ribs groan from inside the cabin. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She put his hand on a rib and pushed the adjacent one inward, and he felt the force travel through the weave, not breaking, not tearing, but flowing the way water flows around a stone. He began pushing snow away from the kitchen collar with a pan, clearing the drift that was packing against the entrance. He did it without instruction. He had understood the principle by feeling it. By dawn, the wind had dropped from a scream to a moan. The temperature still hovered somewhere past 30 below, but the killing force of the storm had passed. Marit sat on the floor beside the stove with her back against the wall and her eyes closed. Her hands were raw. Her shoulders ached from pushing ribs. Her slippers were soaked through. But the cabin was warm enough that breath did not fog near the stove, and Peter Voss was asleep under 2 blankets with color in his face, and the wood box was half full from the last haul. The tunnel sagged in 2 places but remained passable. The willow had bent, and the rawhide had stretched, and the mud had cracked and fallen in pieces, and none of it had mattered because the structure was not in the mud or the lashings but in the weave itself, rod against rod against rod, pressure traveling sideways through a lattice that did not need to be perfect. It needed to be connected. Outside, the prairie was white from edge to edge, no roads visible, no fences, no paths, 30 feet between a kitchen door and a woodshed, and Marit Brecke had walked it 8 times in the dark, while the settlement around her froze shut. But the doors had not opened yet. The damage had not been counted, and the men who had called her work-a-worm had not yet seen what the worm had done. Morning came the color of tin. The wind had not stopped, but the killing force had gone out of it, leaving a steady push that drove loose powder across the surface of the drifts in low ribbons. The prairie was erased. Fence lines that had marked property for 3 years were gone beneath white ridges that rose and fell without reference to anything human. The wagon road was a memory. The schoolhouse was a dark shape with snow packed to the eaves on the north side and the door buried past the handle. Pike's store had a drift over the back steps nearly as high as the lintel. Marit's tunnel appeared as a long, smooth mound between cabin and shed, white and rounded, with 2 dark openings kept clear by the work she had done from inside through the night. From a distance it looked like a low wall of snow. Only the collar mouths, dark against the white, showed that something hollow lived beneath the surface. Amos Hask arrived first. He had chopped through his window frame in the storm, and he came across the prairie on foot, hatless, his beard iced to the wool scarf wrapped around his jaw. He had walked a mile through waist-deep drifts because the horse could not be reached in the barn. When he came around the south side of Marit's cabin, he stopped. The kitchen door was open. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady column, not the thin, desperate thread of a stove burning its last, but the full fat column of a stove that had been fed through the night. Wood was stacked beside the door, split cottonwood, dry, hauled from the shed. Marit stood in the doorway with a cup of broth in her hand, and behind her, sitting near the stove wrapped in blankets, was Peter Voss. Amos looked at the wood. He looked at the tunnel's kitchen collar, ugly and overbuilt and perfectly intact. He looked at Peter. "How?" Amos said. "Through the tunnel, 8 times. The sled carried 4 logs on the first trip, 6 on the rest." Amos walked to the tunnel entrance and bent to look inside. The interior was dim, smelling of damp clay and cold air and the faint green scent of willow. The floor was scuffed and muddy from boot traffic and sled runners. 2 ribs sagged at the crown where drift weight had pushed them inward, but the passage was open. Navigable. A person could walk through it stooped or crawl through it on hands and knees if the sagging worsened. He straightened up. "I told you winter does not live in baskets," Amos said. A long pause. Wind pushed loose snow across the yard. The chimney smoke bent sideways and straightened. "I was wrong about the basket." He did not make a speech. He did not apologize for the months of doubt. He stood in the cold with ice in his beard and said 5 words that cost more than the $24 Marit had never had. Then he asked if she had coffee, and she did, and they went inside. Lena came next. She ran the last 200 yards. Her skirts were soaked to the knee from wading through drifts, and her face was red and raw from wind, and she did not stop at the door. She went straight to Peter and knelt and put her hands on his face and held him and shook and could not speak. The boy said, "Mama, my fingers hurt." Lena pressed her mouth against his hair and closed her eyes, and the sound she made was not crying exactly. It was the sound of a body releasing a weight it had carried through the night, without knowing whether the weight was grief or gratitude. Marit gave Lena space. She stepped outside and stood near the tunnel entrance and waited. When Lena came out, her eyes were swollen, but her voice was steady. "Show me," Lena said. Marit walked her through the tunnel. She showed her the ribs and the weave, and the places where the crown had sagged and where the lashings had stretched. She showed her the snow packed against the exterior, the drift that had become insulation instead of destruction. She showed her the woodshed collar and the door that opened inward. Lena touched the walls. She pressed a rib the way Amos had months earlier and felt the flex, and this time the flex was not theoretical. It was proven. The tunnel had flexed under the worst storm in living memory, and it had held. "I want one," Lena said. "From the house to the chicken shed, even short, even small. I will help you build it." "What do you want for payment?" Marit shook her head. "Trade. 2 days of plowing in spring, mending help when I need it, milk sharing if the cow-calf's weak." Lena's jaw tightened. She was not a woman who took charity easily, and the offer of labor trade instead of money was Marit's way of respecting that. They shook hands inside the tunnel, standing in the dim light surrounded by willow ribs that still hummed when the wind pressed. Others came through the day, not all at once, but in waves, the way news travels on a prairie where every trip between houses is an expedition. Amos brought 2 men in the afternoon, Carl Voss, Lena's husband, and a Swede named Petter Lunde, who had lost 3 chickens when his coop door drifted shut and the birds froze before he could reach them. They came to see the tunnel the way men go to see a thing they have been told about but do not believe. Carl ducked inside and came out and stood in the cold and said nothing for a long time. He had told Lena not to help the widow with her basket. He had kept his wife home when Marit needed hands. The tunnel stood as an answer to his calculation, and the answer was that his calculation had been wrong. He asked one question. "How much wood did you move through that thing during the storm?" Marit counted. 8 trips. The first 4 carried 4 logs each. The last 4 carried 6. 40 logs, about 1 cord and 1/4. Carl looked at his own hands. He had spent the blizzard night burning furniture because his woodpile, stacked 8 feet from the kitchen door, was unreachable under drift. His family had slept in their coats around a stove fed with chair legs and shelf boards. He had 8 feet to cover, and he could not cover it. Marit had 30 feet and a woven passage, and she had covered it 8 times in the dark. Petter Lund asked how the ribs were spaced. Marit told him 18 inches, paired, driven deep into the ground. He asked how the weave was locked. She showed him, touching the reversal point where diagonal rods changed direction every 3rd rib. He ran his finger along the weave and stopped at the reversal. "That is not decorative," he said. "No, that is the reason it stands." He asked whether willow was the only material that worked. She said any rod that bent without snapping would serve: willow, green ash, hazel if it could be found, even bundled prairie grass lashed to a frame. The material mattered less than the principle. The principle was flex. The principle was pressure shared. She taught by touch. She put their hands on the ribs and pushed adjacent rods so they could feel the pressure travel sideways through the lattice. Carl flinched the first time the weave moved under his palm. He expected rigidity and felt conversation, the ribs speaking to each other through the diagonal lashing. She showed them the places where the tunnel had failed: cracked daub, loosened lashings, sagging crown, because the failures were as instructive as the successes. The tunnel had not survived by being perfect. It had survived by being repairable, and repairability was a design choice, not an accident. Pike's reaction came through the men who visited him that afternoon. He told 2 customers that Marit was lucky the drift had not crushed her worm. He said the next storm would finish it. He said willow was not construction material and never would be. Amos answered before Marit had the chance. He was at Pike's store buying tobacco when Pike repeated the verdict, and Amos set his money on the counter and said, "Luck did not lash those ribs." Pike did not reply. He made change and looked at the wall. The word spread further. By the end of the week, 4 families had walked to Marit's claim to see the tunnel. 2 asked for help building their own. One man, a German homesteader named Bruns, said he wanted to try the method between his house and the well. Marit told him the well was too far, 60 feet by. and the wind exposure was different. She walked his property with him and suggested a shorter passage from the house to the woodshed only, with the well accessible from the woodshed end during lulls. She was not merely sharing a design. She was reading each property the way her grandmother had read a river. Where does the current press? Where does it release? Where does the bank hold? And where does it give? Teaching brought its own tension. Every passage she helped design carried her reputation. If Bruns built his tunnel wrong because he skipped her instructions and it collapsed, the failure would belong to her method, not to his laziness. She could not control what other hands did with what her hands had made, but she could not stop teaching either. The blizzard had proven that the gap between kitchen and fuel was a killing distance, and she was the only person on the prairie who had closed it. Sieur Asen came back in early February. He arrived on the same mule cart, thinner than before, the cough deeper and wetter. He tied the mule to Merritt's fence post and stood looking at the tunnel for a long time before speaking. The snow had partially melted in a brief thaw, exposing the woven surface beneath emerald, ribs and diagonals coated in cracked daub, the lattice visible through gaps where mud had fallen. Storm damage was plain. 2 ribs had permanent inward bends where drift weight had exceeded even the locking weave's ability to distribute the load. Lashings had stretched or broken in 11 places. The kitchen collar had shifted 2 inches eastward, pulling away from the cabin wall and opening a gap that Marit had stuffed with straw. Sieur ducked inside and walked the full length. He touched every damage point with his fingers, the way a doctor touches a patient, reading the body's history through its injuries. "It moved," he said when he came out. "It moved. And it held. It held." He sat on the mule cart's tailgate and coughed into his fist. When the coughing stopped, he looked at the tunnel entrance and then at Marit, and something passed between them that did not need words. He had taught her the principle, and she had tested it under conditions neither of them could have predicted, and the principle had survived. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but it had survived, and surviving was the only test that mattered on the prairie. They began improving the method together. Sieur studied the damage points and identified a pattern. Every failure occurred where the diagonal weave had been woven in the same direction for more than 3 ribs. The reversal pattern, changing direction every 3rd rib, worked, but Marit had missed 2 reversal points during construction, probably at moments when exhaustion or cold had blurred her count. Those 2 missed points became stress concentrations where pressure traveled in a straight line and found the weakest lashing. "Count matters," Sieur said. "When your hands are cold and your eyes are tired, the count is the first thing that slips. Mark the reversal points on the ribs. Scratch a line, anything your hands can feel in the dark." They rebuilt the damaged sections together. Sieur cut new rods while Marit stripped the broken weavers. They worked side by side, and the rhythm was easy. The rhythm of 2 people who understood each other's movements without conversation. Sieur's cough interrupted the rhythm every few minutes, bending him forward over his knees, and each time Marit waited without speaking, and each time he straightened and continued. On the second afternoon, they disagreed. Marit wanted to double the rib spacing near the crown, adding a 2nd rod to each arch at the highest point, where drift pressure was greatest. Sieur said no. A doubled rib was stiffer than a single rib, and stiffness was the enemy. "You are thinking like a carpenter," Sieur said. "You want to make it stronger by making it thicker. That is not how willow works. Willow works by giving. If you stiffen the crown, the pressure cannot travel into the sides, and the sides will tear free from the ground." The crown sagged under the storm. 2 places. I had to push them back by hand. And you could push them back because they were single rods that flexed under your shoulder. If they were doubled, they would resist your push and then crack. You would be inside a tunnel that was stronger than you. That is not better. Marit looked at the crown and saw what he meant. The tunnel's survival depended on the conversation between its parts. Pressure moving from rib to rib to rib, each one giving a little so that none gave too much. A doubled rib would break that conversation. It would hold while the storm was moderate and then fail all at once when the load exceeded its doubled strength, instead of flexing gradually and letting a human shoulder redistribute the weight. The tunnel is not a building. Sieur said. It is a negotiation between the wood and the wind. You are the third party. You settle the disputes by hand. If you take yourself out of the negotiation by making it too strong to need you, it will fail the one time it needs you most. She accepted the lesson and did not double the ribs. Over the following weeks, Sieur stayed. He slept in the woodshed on a pallet of straw because the cabin was too warm for his cough. Heat made it worse, he said, though Mart suspected the truth was that he did not want the children to hear him through the night. He ate little. He worked steadily but slowly, and the slowness was new. Tasks that had taken him an hour in October now took 2. He set down tools to rest more frequently, and each rest lasted longer, and he looked at the sky during those rests as if checking how much light remained. He told Marie about his father, a Métis trader who had worked the Red River cart routes before the buffalo collapsed, and the trade dried up. His father had built shelters from anything: snow, brush, hide, bark, sod, and every shelter was different because every site was different. He never built the same thing twice, Sieur said. He built what the land told him to build. Marit asked what happened to him. Sieur said his father had frozen on the trail in 1871, caught in a storm between Fort Garry and Pembina. He had been alone. He had no passage between where he was and where he needed to be. The echo of Tolef's death was not accidental in the telling. Sieur knew exactly what story he was inside, and he knew what the gap between shelter and fuel could cost because it had cost him a father the same way it had cost Marit a husband. They worked the tunnel repairs together in a rhythm that Marit would remember for the rest of her life. Sieur held rods in position while she lashed. She stripped bark for ties while he graded new stock by bend and sound. He showed her a trick for testing lashings by tugging sideways. If the knot slipped a 1/4 inch, it would fail under load. If it held firm, the tie was good. They spoke little during the work. The work was the conversation. Niels began joining them after school. Sieur showed the boy how to cut a rod at the base without splitting the bark above the cut. A diagonal stroke with the hatchet, not a chop, so the fibers separated cleanly. Niels was awkward at first, chopping too hard, cracking rods he should have kept. Sieur corrected him without impatience, the way he had corrected Marit, by showing the right method once and then watching until the boy's hands found it. This became Sieur's final lesson, delivered not as a single moment, but as a principle that emerged across 3 weeks of repair work and a new project: a short passage from the schoolhouse to its coal shed. The schoolhouse project was Amos's idea. After the blizzard, 2 families had petitioned the township for a covered coal route because children had nearly frozen when the stove ran low and the coal was unreachable outside. Amos suggested Marit. The township offered nothing, but Amos and Carl Voss donated labor. Sieur walked the schoolhouse property with Marit and pointed southeast. The entrance faces that way. Why? The prevailing wind comes from the northwest. The entrance faces away from it. Yes, but the drift will pile on the southeast side of the building. The wind pushes snow around the corner and drops it in the lee. Your entrance will be buried first. Marit looked at the schoolhouse and saw the drift pattern in her mind. Wind curving around the north wall, accelerating at the corner, dropping its load in the calm air behind the building. Sieur was right. The entrance she had planned would sit in the deepest drift zone. Face it northeast, Sieur said. Between the wind and the drift, not directly into either. The snow will pass the entrance instead of filling it. How do you know where the drift builds? Watch the grass. The grass bends where the wind pushes. The grass stands where the wind drops its load. The dead grass in the lee is where the drift will be. He coughed. Do not merely copy a structure, Marit. Read where the wind wants to go. The schoolhouse passage was built in 4 days with 6 people working. It was 12 feet long, lower and wider than Marit's home tunnel, braced with barrel staves at the entrance because the schoolhouse had a proper foundation that could anchor a stiff collar. Sieur supervised the lashing and weave pattern, but did not cut rods. His hands were steady but slower, and the cough had settled into a constant presence, like a second voice speaking underneath his own. He finished the schoolhouse build on a Friday afternoon. That evening, He asked Marit whether the schoolhouse collar faced northeast. "It faces northeast," she said. He nodded. He did not say goodbye. He walked to Amos's house because Amos had a spare room, and the walk to Merritt's cabin was becoming difficult. He died there in late November, not in a storm, not dramatically, but quietly after a night of coughing that ended in silence. Amos found him in the morning, with his coat folded on the chair and his boots by the door, as if he had planned to leave. Marit did not go to the burial. She stayed at the cabin and sat by the stove and looked at the steam kettle that Sjur had used to soften willow rods on the first day he taught her. The kettle sat on the firebox plate, blackened from months of use, the handle wrapped in the same wet burlap they had used together. Near the door, a coil of unused willow leaned against the wall, rods she had cut for the schoolhouse project and not needed. They were drying slowly, losing the green that made them bend. The silence in the cabin was the silence of a man who had taught through his hands, and whose hands were still. She did not cry. She picked up the kettle, filled it with water, and set it on the stove. The steam rose. She took a willow rod from the coil, held it over the steam, and bent it into a curve. The rod complained before it bent. It did not snap. The secondary crisis came in February, during a storm that was not as bad as the blizzard, but bad enough. The schoolhouse stovepipe cracked during a northwest blow, and smoke filled the single room while 14 children and the teacher pressed toward the door. The coal pile was outside, unreachable without the passage Marit had helped build. But the passage had a problem. The section nearest the coal shed had been lashed by Carl Voss, who had skipped Marit's reversal pattern because he thought the diagonal weave was decorative rather than structural. He had woven the rods in a single direction for 6 ribs instead of reversing every 3. Under the February wind, that section began to tear. The diagonals slipped sideways on the ribs, opening gaps wide enough for wind to enter, and the wind caught the loose rods and pulled them further apart. The teacher sent a boy to Amos, and Amos rode to Merritt's cabin through snow that was ankle-deep on the horse and rising. He did not explain. He said, "Schoolhouse," and Merritt was on the horse behind him before he finished the word. She arrived to find the teacher standing at the passage entrance with her coat wrapped around a 7-year-old girl who was shaking. Smoke leaked from the schoolhouse door where the cracked stovepipe vented sideways instead of up. 14 children were outside in the wind, some without hats, because the building was unbreathable. The coal pile sat in the shed 12 feet away, visible through the passage, but the last 4 feet of the passage were open to the storm. The torn section flapped in the wind like a broken wing. Rods that Carl had lashed in a single direction had slipped free of their ties and splayed outward, and the diagonal weavers hung loose, catching wind and tearing further with each gust. She did not have Sjur. She did not have his hands or his eye or the sound of his voice telling her what the wind wanted. She had what he had left her. She loosened the too tight lashings on the damaged section instead of tightening them. Amos, standing behind her, said, "You are loosening them." His voice carried the disbelief of a man who had spent 64 years believing that when something was falling apart, you held it tighter. "The tight lashings are the problem," Marit said. She did not stop working to explain. Her hands were already on the rods, feeling for the reversal points, the places where the diagonal should have changed direction and had not. She found the first missing reversal at the 4th rib, the second at the 7th. Between those 2 points, all the rods ran in the same direction, and pressure had traveled in a straight line and found the weakest tie and torn it. She relashed diagonally with a proper reversal at the 3rd rib, using wire from her coat pocket because wire held faster than rawhide in wet cold. She braced the coal shed collar with a barrel stave she pulled from the schoolhouse kindling pile, wedging it between the ground and the collar's crown to hold the opening rigid while the body of the passage flexed behind it. The section held. Not perfectly. Wind still pushed through one gap near the crown, but held enough that a child could crawl through with a coal bucket and come back alive. She packed snow against the outside of the repaired section, pressing it into the weave with her bare hands until her fingers went white, and the snow sealed the gap the way it had sealed her own tunnel 3 weeks before. 2 boys carried coal through the passage in buckets. The teacher relit the stove with a clear pipe. The children went back inside. The building warmed. No one was hurt. Amos watched Marit work through the entire repair. He watched her loosen lashings instead of tightening them, and he watched the section stabilize, and he understood something that he had not understood before. The tunnel was not a structure you built and left. It was a structure you lived inside and tended. It required a person who understood it, not just the materials, but the principle. He told the town board the following week that Marit Brecka should be paid for future builds, not as charity, as employment. The board argued. Pike, who sat on the board, said paying a woman to weave sticks was not a legitimate expense. Amos said, the sticks kept 14 children alive while your coal sat in a shed you could not reach. The board voted 3-2. Marit would receive $2 per completed passage for any community building. It was not wealth. It was recognition. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is often built long before the danger arrives. Pike voted against the payment. He sat in his chair at the board table with his arms crossed and said that a real corridor built from lumber would not need a woman to repair it every time the wind blew. Nobody answered him because the lumber corridor Pike described would have cost the township more than it spent on the schoolhouse in a year, and everyone in the room knew it. But Pike was not finished. His opposition had shifted from mockery to something harder to fight. The argument that Marit's method was inferior, not because it failed, but because it was cheap, and cheap things were beneath the dignity of a proper settlement. He began talking about proper storm corridors at the store, pitching planked and tar-papered passages that he could supply materials for. The profit motive was naked, but the argument had teeth because people wanted to believe that money could solve problems better than willow. Families chose Marit's method anyway, because willow grew in the slough for free, and straw grew in the field for free, and mud lay under every boot, and labor was the one resource a homesteading family had in surplus. Pike's corridors cost money. Marit's corridors cost time and attention. On the Dakota Prairie in 1888, money was scarcer than both. By the end of the second winter, 6 families had built some version of a protected passage. No two were identical. Lena's was short and low, barely 4 feet tall, connecting house to chicken shed, just enough for a child to crawl through with a basket of feed. Bruns's was wider, braced with scavenged fence slats, running 15 feet from his kitchen to the woodshed. The schoolhouse passage was repaired, relashed, and watched over by Marit every autumn when she walked the ribs and checked the weave. Each build taught Marit something new. Bruns's property sat lower than hers, and the creek bottom flooded in spring, so the willow butts rotted where they met the ground. She showed him how to set the ribs on flat stones instead of driving them into earth, a method Shure had never taught her because Shure had never built on wet ground. She improvised. She watched the water and read where it went, the way Shure had watched the wind, and the answer came not from memory, but from the same principle. Do not fight the place. Build what the place will accept. On a Saturday in late September, 3 families gathered at Marit's claim to build at the same time. Lena brought her daughters. Carl brought a handsaw. Petter Lunde brought a cartload of brush from a hazel thicket he had found 2 miles north. Marit moved between the groups, checking rib spacing with her hand. She no longer measured 18 inches with a stick. Her hand knew the distance the way a baker's hand knows a cup of flour. She corrected lashings by feel. She taught Lena's oldest daughter, Hilda, now 15, how to reverse the diagonal weave by counting aloud. 1, 2, 3, turn. 1, 2, 3, turn. The girl's lips moved as she wove, and the count became rhythm, and the rhythm became structure. Niels corrected a grown man that afternoon. Petter Lunde had tied a lashing where the rod would rub against the diagonal during flex, the same mistake Shure had corrected in Marit months earlier. Niels saw it, walked over, and pointed. That will saw through, he said. Move it to the crossing point. Petter looked at the 12-year-old boy, and then at the lashing, and then moved it without argument, because the boy was right and everyone present knew it. Marit watched her son teach and felt something she did not have a word for. It was not pride. It was recognition, the same recognition Shure had felt when he saw her reject a brittle rod by bend alone. Knowledge moving from hand to hand to hand, each hand adding something the previous one did not know. Marit was no longer a widow building a basket. She was the person people consulted before winter. The authority had shifted, not through argument or confrontation, but through the slow accumulation of evidence that the thing she had built worked, and worked repeatedly, and could be taught. Pike felt the shift. He felt it in the way customers at his store stopped asking his opinion about winter preparation and started asking Marit's. He felt it in the way men who had laughed at the woven worm now asked her to walk their properties. He felt it in the $2 payment from the township, which was not about the money but about the vote. His hostility had not ended. It had gone underground where it was harder to see and harder to fight. But the stove note still sat in his ledger, and Marit still owed on it, and Pike was a patient man. The autumn of 1889 looked different from the autumn before it. The same creek ran through the same slough, and the same willow grew in the same low thickets along the bank. But now, in the weeks before the first hard frost, the slough was not empty. 3 wagons stood at the water's edge on a Tuesday morning in late September. Marit's, Lena's, and Petter Lund's. And 8 people worked among the willow, cutting rods and stacking them in bundles of 20. Marit moved between the cutters the way Shure had moved on the first day she met him, watching hands, listening for the sound of the cut. She corrected a rod angle without speaking, just a touch on the wrist and a redirect. Hilda Voss, 15 now and taller than her mother, cut with a rhythm that was close to right but slightly rushed. Marit slowed her down. "Listen before the cut," she said. "The sound tells you where the grain runs. Cut across the grain and the butt splits. Cut with it and it separates clean." Hilda slowed her stroke and the next rod came free without splitting. She held it up and bent it, and the rod complained, the long, fibrous groan of good green wood. And she smiled because she had learned to hear the sound that meant alive. Niels worked further up the creek, where the willow grew thicker. He was 13 now and carried the hatchet with the ease of a boy who had used it every day for a year. He graded rods by bend without conscious thought, the way a person sorts words into sentences without thinking about grammar. The thick ones went in one pile, the thumb thick in another, the finger-thin whips in a third. His hands knew. By mid-morning, the 3 wagons held enough rods for 2 full passages. Lena was rebuilding her chicken shed tunnel with better rib spacing. Petter was extending his woodshed passage by 8 feet to reach a new coal bin. A 4th project, a short covered walkway between the general store's back door and the outhouse, had been requested by a customer of Pike's, and the irony of that request was not lost on anyone in the slough that morning. Pike had not requested the walkway himself. He had not asked Marit for anything. He sat in his store and sold lumber and nails and tar paper and watched the settlement adopt a method that used none of the things he sold. His proper storm corridors, planked, roofed, expensive, had found no buyers, not because they were bad, because they cost money that homesteaders did not have, while Marit's method cost labor that homesteaders could spare. The stove note still sat in Pike's ledger. Marit had paid down the balance by 40 cents since the blizzard, using the $2 township payment and what she could squeeze from butter and egg sales. She still owed $3.90. It was not a large debt. It was a leash. Pike pulled it occasionally. He mentioned the note to Carl Voss, knowing Carl would mention it to Lena, knowing Lena would tell Marit. The message was indirect but clear. I can still make your winter harder. Every time Marit taught someone to build a passage that did not require Pike's materials, the leash tightened in his mind. He could not compete with Free. He could only remind her that she owed. The late-season ice storm came in March of 1890, the kind of storm that was not dramatic enough to make newspapers, but punishing enough to break things. Freezing rain fell for 2 days. Every surface acquired a shell of glaze ice, fences, eaves, tree branches, roads. The ice was heavy. It pulled down wires and cracked branches, and made every step outside a negotiation with a surface that wanted bodies on the ground. Pike's store coal shed had a flat roof. This was a point of pride for Pike. Flat roofs were modern, urban. a step above the sod-covered slopes that homesteaders built. The flat roof caught the ice and held it because flat surfaces hold everything the sky drops on them. By the second day, the weight of the glaze ice collapsed one corner of the roof, driving a beam through the stored coal and scattering it across the shed floor. The back